So now it's that time again to talk about my favorite movies that I saw for the first time in 2024. This is going to be a massive list. Just because I had so much hard time trying to whittle it down. When I first started doing these videos, I kind of tried to keep it at least 10. And then last year, I expanded upon that. And with this year, I've got 29 of my favorite discoveries. Basically, from 29 to 11, I kind of have them in random order. There's no real ranking of them or anything like that. I had a really hard time trying to rank them, and especially places like 10 through 1, I had a hard time. But I think I can say that once I start talking about 1 through 10, those are more ranked in the order that really impacted me. Especially, I had a hard time with the top 3. And it all kind of depends on which day it is, and honestly they change. But right now, this is what I'm going with. But like I said, once we get to starting the list of 29, spots 29 through 11 are basically in random order, but that doesn't mean that I like them any less. I just think that all of them are they made such an impact on me. But before we get to that, I still have a huge list of honorable mentions that I wanted to go through. And I'll keep these honorable mentions very brief since the main list is going to be very long. So starting off with these honorable mentions, I wanted to start with Internal Affairs. This is a great neo-noir crime thriller that has probably Richard Gere's best performance in it. Just keeps moving and escalating to points where you have no idea where it's going to go next. Narrow Margin. This is another fantastic neo-noir thriller from director Peter Hyams, who shoots this with such skill and craft. And there are so many surprising things that happen in this movie. And the scenery that is chosen for this movie is perfect and works narratively to keep the characters on the train at all times. Peeping Tom. This is one of the most revolutionary horror movies and one that I feel I will be revisiting a lot. I actually read the script for this movie before watching the movie, and it really showed me how much Michael Powell brings to this movie in terms of his visual style. But, I mean, that's just a given because, I mean, it's Michael Powell. The Brides of Dracula. To me, I think this might be my favorite Hammer horror movie. I love the performances and especially the story about unleashing this evil that begins to spread. And the last 20 minutes are some of the coolest vampire filmmaking I've ever seen. The Black Room. This is one of the more creepier movies I've seen all year, and the new Blu-ray from Vinegar Syndrome shows how good this movie looks, especially from the gliding camera work that's done. The ending of this movie honestly kind of blew me away with the direction that it took and really made me recontextualize the whole entire movie. Midnight. This is a really interesting regional horror movie from John Russo. There are a lot of really shocking and surprising turns this movie makes, and I just had a really good time watching this for the first time back in October. Joyride. This is the movie from 1977 that I really had never heard of before. It's essentially a crime hangout road movie with some amazing performances, and the use of location filmmaking in Alaska and Washington are just so beautiful to watch and really lends to the mood and feel of it. And the movie itself edges towards some truly dark moments, but it always just goes right up to the edge of it before pulling back. Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore. One of the last Scorsese movies that I hadn't watched all the way through, and I find this movie endlessly fascinating, especially where it comes in Scorsese's filmography. But as a whole, it's just a fantastic movie, and one where I really saw a lot of what would eventually become the modern rom-com, with just elements of so many things that you would eventually see, but all told with that 70s hard edge lens. Venom. This is the 1981 version of this title, and one that has one of the most insane casts I think ever put to film. One where I could not imagine being on the set during this, but a movie that is so much fun to watch, and it truly does a good job with balancing different genre shifts. From a British crime movie to a hostage situation to a siege movie, and then you drop a venomous snake in the middle and you have an animal attack movie. This was such a cool movie. Bringing Up Baby. Probably the definition of a classic screwball comedy. This one just continues to build on itself until the final act where all these Jenga pieces come falling down in a hilarious sequence involving a jail. Cary Grant and Katharine Hepburn are so charming together that they carry you through this crazy plot. The little girl who lives down the lane. This is a great little mystery crime thriller that dips its toe into the horror genre at various points. Jodie Foster is terrific in this, and Martin Sheen plays a very disturbing and grotesque character that you just hate throughout the runtime. You never know where this movie's going until the very ending, and it deliberately refrains from showing the audience certain details. It trusts the audience to fill in those blanks. Night Beast. I love Don Dohler. I love his filmmaking, and I love his spirit for creating things that he loves. Night Beast is such a fun regional horror movie. Every one of his movies that I've seen, I've loved. Every one of his movies that I've seen, I've liked, and have all contained interesting genre-mashing elements. Don't Torture a Duckling. Earlier this year, I went on a run of watching a lot of Lucio Fulci movies. Out of all the new ones that I watched, this one stood out as my favorite. It's such a grimy horror mystery with elements that are still shocking to this day. And the ending is something that needs to be seen, and it's just a pure use of cinematic style. Horror in the High Desert 2. Minerva. With this entry, I'm going to kind of cheat a little bit, and I really need to expand upon this entry just a little bit longer than what I have with the previous entries. So I have a little background story to tell you with this entry. Last Halloween, I talked about Horror in the High Desert. I still stand by my stance that that is one of the scariest things that I have ever seen. But it's a movie that's scary to me. And I know that other people's mileage may vary on it. You know, everybody has their different thing that they're scared of, but there's something with that movie that just, it like unlocked this horror that I just never knew was there. So after the viewing of the first one, I was kind of legitimately nervous to view this second one, but it was an excited nervousness. I love being scared by movies, so I wanted to savor it. I knew that a lot of people had said that the second one is a very good improvement on the first one, and while I was nervous to watch it, I was so excited that I was nervous to watch a movie, if that makes sense. So for a long time, I sat on it. You know, I decided not to hit play. But one day on May 20th, 2024, I had this overwhelming urge to watch the sequel. I have no idea what compelled me to watch it, so that night I sat down and I watched it. After the credits rolled, I went ahead and I logged it on my Letterboxd, but out of curiosity, I went back to see when I watched the first one. I logged Horror in the High Desert 2 on May 20th, 2024, and I logged Horror in the High Desert on May 20th, 2023. That was such an eerie feeling to have, and also really, really cool that happened. But with all that said, when I finished watching the sequel, I am not exaggerating when I say this, I was literally covered in sweat from being so tense throughout it. I have never had that happen while watching a movie in my entire life, ever. Dutch Marich, if I'm pronouncing that right, his use of stillness, narration, found footage, and especially the restraint just further proves that he is an extremely talented director of horror and tension, and that everyone should seek out these movies if that sounds intriguing to them. Night Riders. I think a lot of people go right past this title in Romero's filmography. I did for the longest time, but when I finally sat down and watched it, I was kind of blown away by how he constructs this movie, and especially how emotional it gets towards the ending. The first 40 minutes essentially play out in real time as we watch this medieval troupe act out this show. It's among one of Romero's best movies, and I wish I could see a world where he made more movies like this. Don't get me wrong, I love his horror movies. His 3 Living Dead movies are among my favorite movies, but I would be interested to see where his career would have gone if this was a huge success back in the day. And I think it's honestly one of the great unsung movies from the early 80s. Butcher Baker Nightmare Maker. Susan Tyrrell. That's honestly all you have to say about this movie. She devours the entire screen throughout and gives one of the most committed and scariest performances in any horror movie. The 8 Diagram Pole Fighter. For me, this movie not only has truly amazing action sequences and ones that are so memorable, but I think the emotional core of this movie and the main character are what really hooked me throughout. It's definitely one of the best kung fu movies I've ever seen. Death Hunt. This is a fantastic man on the run movie. You feel the cold throughout, and Charles Bronson and Lee Marvin are so effortlessly good here, but I truly loved the escalation of events, where we see every step of how this small interaction spirals out of control and eventually propels Bronson into this rampage that is so entertaining to see. Massacre at Central High. This movie has such a weird tone to it that switches from high school movie to pure thriller to slasher to dark comedy. It's all over the place, but I really clicked with it, and I always wanted to see where it would go next and what genre it would start to delve into. A Face in the Crowd. This is a fantastic movie from Elia Kazan. Andy Griffith's performance is so against type in this, and I was shocked he wasn't nominated for an Oscar for this. But the actor that I came away remembering their performance the most is Walter Matthau, who I just love in everything that he's in. He has a short monologue at the ending of this movie that may be the best acting he's ever done in any movie, and it's among my favorite scenes of the entire year. So now that that's over, let's get to my favorite film discoveries of 2024. Number 29, Muppets from Space. I am shocked by how much I loved watching this movie, especially since this is considered one of the lesser Muppet movies, but I do have to say the only other Muppet movie that I've seen is the very first one, and even that was so long ago that I don't really remember it. The setting for watching this movie was perfect. It was on the eclipse day this year, and it was in a packed theater on 35mm film. I just had the funnest time watching this movie. I loved the story, and I was completely fine with the majority of this movie taking place on Earth. I liked that. But for me, my favorite standout here is Pepe. I don't know what it is about Pepe, but he might be my favorite Muppet. I love how well-spoken he is, but then you have this contrast with his hairstyle and bulging eyes. I just think it's such a funny character, and I just find him super, super entertaining. Number 28, Dead Bang. Now for a movie that was also a lot of fun. A Christmas action thriller starring Don Johnson and directed by John Frankenheimer. With Johnson, I've really never sought out his movies much. I've never seen Miami Vice, and I mainly only know him for the movies that he's done since around 2012. He is so charismatic in this, and the movie leans into that and asks you to stay with this very damaged character. But Johnson takes the audience with that charisma and just makes every scene riveting. I just love the setting in the second half, where we go from the city to a small town to basically in the middle of this wooded compound. Number 27, Out of the Blue. This might take the cake for the bleakest movie I saw all year. One that is a masterpiece of bringing the 70s New Hollywood into the 80s and bringing the punk scene with it. But the craziest thing to me is that it's essentially lost to time after that, and only really has gained such a strong reputation in recent years. Dennis Hopper directs this with such rawness for the story. When you know his backstory and where he would go after this, it just adds a whole another layer of emotion to it. But Linda Mann's performance is completely fearless. She carries every scene with so much emotion and things that are packed away for long periods of time. and they all come flooding back in those last 15 minutes of this movie. Seriously, if you have seen this movie, then you know how bleak and sad this movie gets within those last 15 minutes. But I loved where it went, and that's where this movie kind of went up and just tipped over into this being a masterpiece. It commits fully to this vision of these characters in this world. Number 26, Looking for Mr. Goodbar. Continuing on the note of bleakness, I was able to rent this movie on the original VHS release. While it just got a recent 4K release from Vinegar Syndrome, I still love the memory of watching this movie on VHS for the first time. Diane Keaton is the absolute standout here. I honestly had no idea she was able to go to this level. Given that this movie came out the same year as Annie Hall, and is the complete opposite, says so much about the type of range she has. This all leads up to an ending that is so dark and disturbing and just left me speechless while the credits rolled. Number 25, Busting. I was not expecting this movie to blow me away as it did. You essentially follow Elliot Gould's and Robert Blake's characters as they go from case to case. But what I loved about this movie most is the directing by Peter Hyams. This movie has so much energy to it. I think these might be some of the best foot chase sequences ever put to film. He utilizes a dolly that just follows the people involved with the chase, and it's riveting throughout. Number 24, Private Parts. Coming from director Paul Bartel, this movie feels like if you mixed Eraserhead, Barton Fink, Hitchcock, and John Waters, and then filmed it in 1972. Bartel is so good with gradually revealing things to the audience and keeping the audience in a genuine suspense and then ratcheting up the horror in small bits. And even in one scene, having a character do something to a doll that I have never seen done in a movie before. It's a scene that is gross, horrifying, but also hints at what is to be revealed by this character, and is an excellent way of conveying that reveal subtly. Number 23, I Am a Fugitive from a Chain Gang. I used to see this title pop up on TCM many times, but never really decided to watch it, even though that I love prison movies. And I finally did decide to watch it, and this is such a bleak movie from its time. Paul Muni imbues this character with so much empathy that every time you think his character will catch a break, something just comes along and devastates him in the audience. Plus, it's just a roller coaster of different emotions and even genres throughout. You feel like you've been on this grand epic journey by the end, but it all leads to this bleak, hopeless road. Number 22, Heavenly Bodies. If you want one of the funnest times in a movie, just watch Heavenly Bodies. Yes, it does have a very familiar formula, but this movie pulls that formula off in an excellent and satisfying way. It just nails the beats and makes you care about all of the characters and what's happening. From the soundtrack to the dance marathon ending and the charismatic lead performance by Cynthia Dale. Number 21, Modern Romance. I've heard about this title from Albert Brooks for many, many years. So far, I've seen Defending Your Life, Lost in America, and Real Life. Out of all of them, Modern Romance is my favorite. There are so many stretches throughout this movie where it's just Albert Brooks on screen, particularly one towards the beginning that is probably my favorite sequence in the movie. But then you have the whole angle of him working as a film editor, and these are the scenes that bring the movie full circle and make it my favorite movie of his. They are just endlessly fascinating and fun to watch. Number 20. So for this one, I'm actually going to combine number 20, 19, and 18, because this is what I'm going to call the Frank Perry section. This year, I delved into his work, and I'm still making my way through it. I started with The Swimmer. It fit into my favorite genre of movies, which is the all-in-one-day movie. But when I sat down to watch it, it became so much more than just that. This movie really made me want to analyze it. While the premise is a simple get from A location to B location, what happens on the way is far from a straight line. This delves into so much of Burt Lancaster's character's life, his failings, the false reality he presents himself, and all of this can be read in a completely different way for someone, which is just a fantastic feeling. Then with number 19, I went with the next Frank Perry movie that I watched, Man on a Swing, which surprised me with how unsettling and creepy this movie is. It's essentially a police procedural with an amazing performance by Joel Grey. This movie purposely leaves things ambiguous and leaves on an incredibly unsettling note. And it's a movie that I feel is a big influence on the huge boom of mystery crime thrillers in the 80s and 90s. Then at number 18, I finally watched Ladybug, Ladybug. The whole premise is a school out in the middle of the country is informed that a nuclear war is about to break out. The rest of the movie plays out in real time as the school sends the kids home, and we track one group of students and their teacher as they try to grapple with the news on if it's real or not. This also leaves on a horrifyingly ambiguous note. And the whole movie, with the scenery that Perry captures, is very reminiscent of The Swimmer. And I've come to realize that Perry really captures the vibe and feeling of being in outdoor spaces. All three of these movies are very, very well worth your time, and I cannot wait to see more of his movies. Number 17, Nightmare in Badham County. I'd heard about this title for a number of years, and for some reason I kept saying I would get to it eventually, which honestly, I can say that with a lot of movies. Now that I've seen it, this is one of the most brutal prison movies I've ever seen. Every inch of this movie is filmed with this hopelessness, especially for these two main characters who have to endure the worst things possible. Every single time you think that they are going to escape this horrible situation, something comes along and makes the situation even worse. This is a feel-bad movie in the best way possible. Number 16, Leave Her to Heaven. This is a movie that does not feel of its time at all. It's a movie that's one of the darkest things to come out of the 40s, and I've never seen a movie quite like it. It's beautiful in its use of Technicolor, and the locations that this movie utilizes just sets the perfect mood for the rest of the movie. But my gosh, the things that Gene Tierney does in this movie are some of the darkest things I've ever seen a character do. Number 15, Minnie and Moskowitz. I'm still slowly working my way through John Cassavetes films one at a time. This year, with Gena Rowlands passing away, I wanted to watch Minnie and Moskowitz. The whole movie hinges on the performance of Gena Rowlands and Seymour Cassel, and to say they're perfect in this movie would be the most blatant understatement. They are probably their chemistry and their performances are just some of the best things to come out of the 70s. And I never really took notice of Cassel until seeing this movie, and the way he interacts with people and even talks is unlike anything I've ever seen, and I have just loved seeing him pop up in things now. Number 14, The Big Combo. I'm really falling in love with Joseph H. Lewis's style. Ever since seeing Terror in a Texas Town last year, this one continues that streak of noir-tinged movies where you have all of these interesting characters that fill the screen, as Lewis blocks them with such mastery of the craft. Cornel Wilde and especially Richard Conte are incredible in this movie. Conte plays a villain that is so intimidating and just such a really, really expertly written noir antagonist. Number 13, The Wanderers. For me, this movie feels like one of the great not talked about movies from the late 70s. It feels epic in its scope, and Philip Kaufman just feels like he's pulling together everything that he's always wanted to do with a movie. And I absolutely love that he's still able to fit in a horror sequence involving a game in this movie, especially since this is just 1 year after his version of Invasion of the Body Snatchers. There is just something about this movie that has really stuck with me throughout the entire year. Number 12, Endangered Species. This movie comes from Alan Rudolph. It's a science fiction mystery thriller with a bit of a horror tinge to it. It all takes place in a small town and has some amazing supporting characters like Gaylord Sartain, Hoyt Axton, and even Paul Dooley. The vibe of this movie kind of reminded me of the movie Warning Sign from 1985. And I will say, for a majority, this is a conspiracy thriller. But there is a scene in this movie that shocked me so much and came out of nowhere that my jaw was on the floor. It's one of the most gruesome things I've seen and delves so much into body horror that I kind of just sat there and processed what I just saw. And immediately after, I thought that was one of the coolest things I've ever seen done in a movie. Number 11, Cleo from 5 to 7. This is my very first Agnes Varda film, and probably her most famous one. Now, this movie is, again, an all-in-one-day movie, but there's something that was holding me back from pressing play. The whole premise of a woman wandering around Paris and anticipating a call from the doctor at 7 p.m. that will inform her if she has cancer or not. It sounds like a depressing watch. And while that premise in the movie does have that air of sadness and melancholy, it was such a rejuvenating movie for me. One that dives deep into so many different small aspects of one's life and the small pleasures that we experience every single day. Laughter, sadness, food, love, walking, and so much more. I love the movie so much, and after watching this, I experienced such a euphoric feeling. You know that feeling where you watch a movie that keeps doing everything right and you love all the directions it's taking you? That kind of feeling. I think the lead is so compelling in this and has to carry the entire movie on her back as she walks around Paris encountering all these interesting characters and locations. This is probably one of the ultimate vibe movies, where if you're on this movie's wavelength, it'll grab a hold of you so tight. Varda's style in this is incredibly intimate and controlled, where you just feel this explosion of different types of choices that she is making throughout. All right, now we're in it. Now here are the 10 choices. Number 10, The Hudsucker Proxy. The Coens are a cinematic staple in my opinion. I do love a lot of their movies. Their style and sense of humor and setup and payoff continues to grow on me every single year. But for the longest time, I heard that this is one of their worst movies. It performed badly back in the day, and it didn't really do well with critics or honestly the audience. You really never hear it brought up aside from, oh, it was one of their few failures that they made. And now after seeing it, I have no idea why it's considered that. It might be one of my favorite movies from them. It's so unapologetically goofy and has the perfect madcap energy of some of the best slapstick comedies. It's also such a rewatchable movie too, from the individual scenes to everything going on in the background. And it's one of the few movies that I saw for the first time this year that I again rewatched this year. And on the second time, Jennifer Jason Leigh's performance in this movie, I think is just, it's one of the best performances I think ever given in a comedy. I think she does things in this movie and maintains this tone throughout that just, it is so moving and so funny and so compelling to watch. Number 9, Magic Spot. I delved further into the world of Matt Farley and Charlie Roxburgh. Local Legends was one of the best things I saw last year. This year, I watched Monsters, Marriage, and Murder in Manch Vegas, heard She Got Married, and I did a rewatch of Don't Let the River Beast Get You, and finally, Magic Spot. I love this movie so much. The winter setting that they capture just feels so lived in, and it's like something that I personally see every single day. Then you have this whole plot about time travel that is so captivating, and the fact that they have all of the characters just accept the fact that there is a magical spot where you can just time travel. No character is caught off guard by this or is suspicious of it. They all just cut right to it, and every character fully accepts it as a reality. It's just so refreshing for a story. I started caring about these characters so much, and in particular during a sequence when a potential danger could occur when a character is trying to acclimate properly. I think this and Don't Let the River Beast Get You are two of my favorites of theirs, and I just cannot wait to check out Heard She Got Murdered next. Number 8, Violent Saturday. This is a movie that came out of nowhere and completely blew me away. It's a grand-scale CinemaScope film noir directed by Richard Fleischer, and this movie is essentially the lead-up to a bank robbery, one that takes place in a small town. But what the film does brilliantly is it fleshes out literally every single character. Whether they be involved with a robbery or the people in the town, they are all fleshed out in such a masterfully told way. Every character has their moment. Even Lee Marvin, who is essentially just one of the robbery goons, but he has this excellent scene where he transforms into a three-dimensional character. But after all of this, you have the third act after the bank robbery, which is just one of the best and most suspenseful sequences ever made in a film noir. And it all involves a barn, a car, and Ernest Borgnine as an Amish farmer. Number 7, The Bounty. This movie was my first exposure to the story of Mutiny on the Bounty. There is a whole behind-the-scenes production history with this, where it was originally supposed to be directed by David Lean and split into 2 parts, but then that all fell through. It's a really fascinating read, but what ultimately got me interested in finally checking this out was probably by the simplest means, the score by Vangelis. This synth score, combined with the 1700s setting, is such a perfect combination, and I loved this movie. The whole cast are incredible, and where the story eventually goes just left me wanting to know every single detail about what happened, especially the things that became legend. Number 6, Cops and Robbers. I love me some 70s crime films, and this one, directed by Aram Avakian, if I'm pronouncing that right, is one of the best I've seen. It stars Cliff Gorman and Joseph Bologna. 2 cops, after being fed up with their jobs, decide to pull off a heist. These 2 actors play off each other so well, and they are incredibly funny together. It combines some of the best aspects of 70s filmmaking. On-location shooting, great character actors like Joe Spinell, tense set pieces, and tight direction. Avakian utilizes a lot of panning long takes that are super impressive to see unfold. This movie came as a complete surprise to me and makes me shocked it's not talked about more. Number 5, In Cold Blood. Along with Looking for Mr. Goodbar, I delved into more of Richard Brooks' movies. Granted, I still have a lot to go through, and I know that he can be very hit or miss with people, but from what I've seen, both of these movies just blew me away. This movie feels so much of an inverse of Brooks' previous movie, The Professionals, where with that movie, it feels like a classic men on a mission crowd pleaser. This is the movie he makes the next year and just feels so grimy and dirty and real. The reincorporation and style throughout is so impressive and well thought out. From the structure of the movie, the shots, the performances, and even scenes leading into another. It's just a fantastic, well-oiled machine. Number 4, The Last Seduction. I think out of all the movies I've seen this year, this movie has my favorite line reading of the year from Bill Pullman towards the end of this movie. It's like if the director just said, go for it. Even though you're tied up and your mouth is gagged, just go for it. And he nailed it. This might be one of the best neo-noir films I've ever seen. I think it's almost solely based on the performance of Linda Fiorentino and her character. She is captivating and ice cold throughout the entire movie, and she remains at that level. You get small glimpses into her character, but she deliberately doesn't let the audience understand her, and I love that. She is ruthless and will do anything to get what she wants. It's probably the most fascinating character I've seen this year. John Dahl directs this with such precision and confidence, and it feels like it's the elevated next step of Red Rock West, which I also loved, but this movie as a whole is him working with everything that he has and delivering one of the best neo-noirs. Number 3, Monsieur Verdoux. I think the thing that makes this movie truly one of the darkest comedies is when you put it into context of where this movie came in Charlie Chaplin's filmography. The fact that this is his follow-up to The Great Dictator, and the fact that the story and the character of Monsieur Verdoux is a complete inverse of what he was doing with The Great Dictator. Honestly, just talking about this movie feels like I can't even begin to do it justice. I think it's one of the best dark comedies ever made, and a movie that floored me when I saw it. There are sequences of suspense and reveals to the audience that make me think of some of the best sequences in Hitchcock movies. Among all of this, you have Chaplin playing the titular character, and he is an incredibly abrasive character, and you, the audience, have to be with him throughout the entire runtime, as he does some of the most heinous stuff imaginable. And the movie makes you constantly ask, how far will he go? And how will he proceed with his plans next? And I just think that this is such a fascinating movie. especially one where you can see the audience react to it and just see what people think of this movie afterwards. And to me, this is truly one of the great dark comedies, and I feel just one of the greatest movies to come out of the 40s. Number 2, Nothing But a Man. Before seeing this movie, I had no real prior knowledge of it, even existing, or even of the director Michael Romer. But this movie kind of came out of nowhere, and I can't think of the last time where a movie floored me and made me so emotionally invested in what happens to the characters. The two characters of Duff and Josie are some of the most fleshed out characters I've ever seen in a movie, or any just piece of media, books, games, or just anything. The struggles that they go through, from dealing with racism, finding jobs, finding a house, and starting a family, are just so engrossing that I felt myself leaning closer and closer to the screen as the film progressed. Ivan Dixon's performance in this movie is probably one of the most natural and real performances I've seen, and the fact that you have such a strong central performance in it, I just cannot get over how strong the two central performances are from Dixon himself and Abby Lincoln. But then you populate this movie with some of the best character actors ever put in film. Yaphet Kotto and Richard Ward just takes this movie to another level, and it feels so real and lived in. And the way Romer shoots this movie is something I've never seen in American cinema in the 60s. It feels like a French New Wave movie just made in America. I don't think a week has gone by this entire year where I haven't thought about this movie. Number 1, Divorce Italian Style. For the longest time, whenever I heard of this title, I always was put off from seeing it because I kind of just took it at face value. I thought it was basically just what the title said, a divorce story. But that was until I actually took the time and read the synopsis. Now, after reading the synopsis and having seen the movie, that title is one of the funniest and best titles I think ever. You essentially have a movie where Marcello Mastroianni devises a plan to trick his wife into having an affair, where then he can kill her and get a light sentence since his wife committed adultery, and finally marry his cousin. That is an insane plot, and the movie knows this. It delves straight into the satire of the class system of Italy and how a small town can perceive someone who is planning a horrible crime, but not just the class system, the justice system, and especially how marriage in Italy worked. The whole thing is one great big satire on Italian customs. And in the end, you have a fantastic movie that is wickedly entertaining. And the lead performance by Mastroianni is just, it's beyond great. I just did not see him. He just became this character. His character is so evil in his motives. The audience just loves watching, see how big of a hole he is digging for himself. Not to mention, there's a small subplot that is essentially one big fourth wall break. Also, this movie left me with one of the best final shots in probably any movie I've ever seen. A shot so good and genius that I guarantee you a packed theater audience would just go nuts for it. And that's it. That's my list. That is all my favorite discoveries of 2024. And I remember last year I did get a lot of good recommendations that I still need to check out. One of them was this movie that I have recently purchased on Blu-ray that I really, really want to check out called, I think it's called Gina from 1975, which I'm really excited to check out this upcoming year. But I also want to hear about what other people thought of their first time watches. What were their favorites? What were some that just kind of came out of nowhere and just floored them? And I love seeing people's recommendations. All right, see you later.